All right, well, we'll get started here in about a minute. Here we go. It's 5:30, so we'll go ahead and get started here. I don't think I have a moderator in this room, which is fine. Um, should be able to manage pretty well here without one. I'm going to do my best to monitor the Jabber chat room for questions and things like that, and I'll take notice of questions and answers as they get posed inside of live meeting. So, all right. Well, thank you for. It's been a long day, but thank you for attending ASP Conf. My name is John Peterson. I'm actually one of the organizers, along with Eric Hexter, John Galloway, Javier Lozano, and I hope you're having a great time at this show. So. In this session, I want to talk to you a bit about an introduction to the ASP.NET Web API. There's actually been a lot of coverage of the API in this show, and obviously you'll be able to go back when things are posted up on Channel 9 and look at the other sessions. There's certainly been some great coverage of it. So this is going to be an introductory talk, really beneficial for those that really don't have any experience with the Web API or REST in general, because one of the things that you'll notice is that this topic of data serialization, RESTful APIs, really sits at the heart of disconnected systems, Azure, a lot of the things that have been talked about today, and more things that will be talked about tomorrow. And it's really at the heart of Microsoft's web strategy and the stack. So if you're kind of on the fence of whether or not you need to know this stuff, you definitely need to know it. So again, thank you for attending. So this is my information. This is my blog. I blog over at Code Better, and this is my Twitter handle. I encourage you to follow me. I'll be posting some updates and things like that about this session. And with that, we'll go from there. Now, one preliminary matter I'll ask you to do is, and this is the schedule. This is my section right here. Please rate it. Look forward to your feedback. Doing our best to deal with a lot of the technical issues. It's not always easy giving a session like this. This is my third year. First two is MVC Conf, and then obviously this year. But we don't get to see your faces, so we don't really know whether you're actually hearing things and things like that. So please be sure to give as much feedback during the presentation as you can. Just so you know, the way that I have my setup here is that I actually have another laptop that's in the role of the attendee, so that I do see what you're seeing. So I will do my very best to deal with lags and things like that. That's one of the special challenges that we have when we're doing live conferences, not in virtual conferences like this, not in person. So please rate the show and rate the session, and please rate all the sessions. So just a little bit about me. I'm one of the organizers. I'm the Microsoft Practice Director for CEI, which is a Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania-based consulting organization. I'm an ASP.NET and IIS MVP. I'm also a Pluralsight author. I just wrote the course, which is an intro to NuGet, and which already has to be updated. I'm a Telerik insider, along with other folks like Dave Giard. We are sponsored by Telerik. This show is also sponsored by Telerik, and they afford us the opportunity to travel around and to provide service to the community and present a variety of topics. Being in the Philadelphia area, that's where I'm located. I'm one of the organizers of Philly Code Camp, and I've been a pretty long time contributor to Code Magazine. So let's get right into the heart of it here. So when we're talking about the ASP.NET Web API, what we're really talking about is REST, representational state transfer. That's the basis of the web. And what we really mean by all this is that at the end of the day, we're serializing and deserializing data. We make requests to a server. It does a lot of stuff. It sends stuff back. The data is, at that point, serialized, going across the wire. Now, the one thing I am going to ask, I think I hear somebody's microphone going. Please mute your microphones periodically. I will Make sure that everyone else is muted except me. Thank you very much for your cooperation on that. So this whole notion of data serialization and deserialization, if you go back to Scott Gu's keynote about loosely coupled systems, they're the most flexible. This idea of services, that's essentially what the web is, and that's really where you want your data to be. Now, the beauty about REST is it's already based on something that we all know, HTTP. So there's no new protocol that you have to learn. And again, the whole idea here is loose coupling of systems, services, and clients. And for the use case for all of us is really about exposing our data. We want our data to be out there. Imagine you have this application, maybe it's an MVC application or a web forms application, but you've got some data and somebody in your organization wants access to that data. The best thing that could happen is a situation where you make your data available without any assumptions about how that data is going to be consumed. Makes your life easier, makes their life easier. So if you're a database developer, really REST is something that's at the heart of what we all do in all of our applications, because no matter what your application does, there are really 4 root things that every application does. We create data, we retrieve data, we update data, and we delete data. And collectively, these are the CRUD operations. No matter all the whiz-bang type of things and the cool HTML5 and things, graphics and animations and things like that, no matter what your application does, broken down, it does these 4 things, at least a few of them. But for the most part, we write data applications, and we're creating data, we're retrieving data, we're updating data, and we're deleting data. So CRUD is central to REST. And if we look at the HTTP protocol, there are 4 basic HTTP verbs that we deal with. We post data, we get data, we put data, and we delete data. And as we come to find out, there's an analog on our data manipulation side of things for each of these verbs. So when we're posting something, for instance, and the hypothetical that I'll use in this session is this simple little products table, products data. If I want to create a new product, I already have a collection of products out there. And if I want to add a new item to that collection, I'm posting a new item to that collection. That translates into a create. And then retrieving data, it's a get. And that's the R in our CRUD. That's the retrieval. The update. So if you're familiar with most web applications, in particular ASP.NET MVC or what have you, we typically deal with 2 verbs in that environment. We're either dealing with gets or posts. And in the generic sense, if you're retrieving data and there's no side effect to what you're doing, that generically would be referred to as a get type of operation. On the other hand, if you're either deleting data, updating data, or creating data, there's some side effect going on. Collectively, that's all a post, and it can all be done with a post. But the idea here with REST is that you're providing an API. And the thing that you're going to learn soon is that the URL actually remains constant. What changes is the verb that you pass to the resource. And that's a bit different than what you may be used to if you've worked with MVC and things like that. So we're kind of taking a little bit of a step back here, getting back to a root area of just dealing with data and how to manipulate data. So if you're thinking like, well, is this like SQL, SQL insert, SQL update, SQL delete? Absolutely. That's really what we're talking about here. And of course, delete is delete. So that's the one that's exactly the same. So why REST? Well, it's simple. The web is RESTful. There's no, if you've ever dealt with SOAP and you've tried to do binding With SOAP, I mean, when it works, but sometimes, it often takes a little bit to get to that end result. It's also universal. So if you can connect to the web, your data can be consumed. So if your data is exposed and it sends out, JSON, then your clients can be just about anything. They can be a mobile application, HTML5, jQuery. They can be a Windows Forms application. They could be a WPF application. They could be another REST service. There's really no limitation. And it's simple. And that's the wonderful thing about it. So if you've ever dealt with, an API, say like the Bing Maps API or anything along those lines, if you've had the choice between dealing a RESTful API and a non-RESTful API, I'll always take the RESTful API. It's a heck of a lot easier. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a place for SOAP. And for those situations where you've got a very strict protocol, you may have some other persistent connection issues, and you may need to have other considerations where WCF is a great fit. None of this is to imply that WCF isn't required. There are plenty of use cases out there. It's just that REST provides this other, easier alternative for you, and with the ASP.NET Web API, it's never been easier to really get up and running. So here's an example. Here's an example URL, and you can see that it looks somewhat like MVC. So, we have this products, and then we have a one. That seems kind of MVC, but then we have this API business. And what we're going to find is that oftentimes our URL is going to actually remain constant. What's going to change are things like the verb and the request body that we send in how we interact with this API. So in this case, if this URL is associated with a GET, what we're really saying is it retrieves data for the products API from the products API for product with ID equal to 1. On the other hand, if it's associated with a delete, it deletes data from the products API for the product with ID equal to 1. Now, for puts and posts, we have to have things in a request body, which I'm going to use a product called Fiddler, which I think has been used on a number of sessions today. So like the other folks that have presented today, if you're not familiar with Fiddler, you should be. And hopefully by the end of MVC, or keep calling it MVC Conf, ASP Conf, it's a free download. If you're writing web applications, you absolutely want to be conversant and up and running with Fiddler, and it's actually quite a simple, very simple product to use. So requests in working with the web API have at least 2 and up to 3 components. So you basically have your resource, your API, your URL, your endpoint. In this case, we have both our URL, and then we have a verb: post, get, put, and delete. Now, when a put or post is involved, then you'll also have content in the request body. So again, you'll have at least 2 things in a request and up to 3. So the REST data typically represented as JSON, JavaScript object notation, a series of key value pairs. If you're familiar with a non-SQL database like RavenDB or Mongo, the data stored, this is the native data format for JSON. It's one of the beautiful things about, or it's the native data format for JavaScript. It's one of the nice things about JSON is that this is a very ubiquitous data type. And as you will see, we will have the ability to take a C# .NET object. We'll serialize it down to JSON. We're going to pass it back to a web API service. It's then going to consume it on the server, and then it's going to deserialize that back to a .NET object, and it's going to do its thing like it normally would, and we'll reverse the process. Now, you can also use XML. Someone's got their microphone open. Please turn off your microphone. Thank you. Now you can use XML. I won't be demonstrating it here. There is a version of the code that I have posted, and I'll share that with you, that does use XML. I pretty much have retooled this presentation just to concentrate on JSON. But you certainly can deal with XML. The Web API out of the box natively deals with either JSON or XML. And soon you'll see how easy that actually is. And again, a tool like Fiddler makes it very simple to interact with the Web API. Now, as I said before, the heart of the Web API is it's REST and it's HTTP. So again, there's a lot of definition already out there. Another reason why you'd want to perhaps expose your data and use a RESTful API, because you're leveraging on a protocol that already has some very defined rules. So for example, if it was a successful action, then it should return a 200 status code. On the other hand, let's say that we were to find we're trying to search on a product. We're trying to search on a product that didn't exist. So, for instance, we're passing a non-existent ID. Well, what happens when you attempt to navigate to a page that doesn't exist on the server? You get a 404. Then a 404 should be returned. On the other hand, maybe there's some other type of exception. It might be a 500, a 501. It just depends. You'll be able to finely tune your Web API to go in line with these HTTP error codes. And again, types of things that you're not going to have to renew. By the way, everybody, if you hear a cat meowing, it's because I have a cat. I have a cat walking around and he's desperate for some attention, so I'm going to try and stave him off. By the way, somebody has their microphone open, so could you please shut it off, please? I'd greatly appreciate it. There we go. Just did it for you. So there we go. So anyway, there we go with our HTTP error codes, and again, they fall right into a RESTful API. So now in this session, I'm going to go ahead and add something like a client like ASP MVC to the mix. Now the idea here is that instead of in our web config having a connection string to a database, instead what I'm going to do is actually have a URL. So the endpoint to my RESTful API is kind of like my database connection string. We still get all the model binding, we get the data attributes, we get everything that we get, as if we were dealing with a database. But the difference is, and this is a big point that Scott Gu was rolling out in his Azure keynote, is that when you're dealing with services, all of a sudden, you get to scale out, you get to scale in so many different ways. And in this case, dealing with a service, imagine, all of a sudden fault tolerance, redundancy becomes a bit easier because it becomes much more easier to flip from one service to another service, and to be able to stand up various, web servers it just becomes much easier. And obviously by exposing your data as a service, you're now not making any assumptions about the type of client that you're interacting with. Again, makes your life easier. It makes the folks that have to consume your data makes their data life a lot easier. So what is the data flow that we're talking about? And by the way, when I get to the code portion of this presentation, that's what I'm going to be using as an MVC client. So again, using MVC as a client, but it could be any type of client. So MVC receives a request. That data is then serialized. So in other words, I'm interacting with the MVC client, and maybe I am updating a product. So what does MVC have to do? Well, it's getting a product object. It's all through the binding. So what it has to do, it's like, well, okay, I got to serialize that. I got to convert that to JSON so that I can then send that request to the Web API. Now, once the Web API receives that request, It then deserializes it, converts it to an object. Same object that was over on the MVC side, but we're completely disconnected now, in another, another portion of our application environment. And then some operation is performed, and then the response is sent back to MVC, which you'll get to see this in a moment. So in this demo application that I have, there's three primary components. We've got the web API. We have the MVC client, and then I also have a number of helper classes that you can use for serialization, some abstractions around HTTP client to make the task between communicating between the web API and an MVC client or a mobile client or whatever it happens to be a lot easier. So if all the source code from here is actually sitting up on GitHub, so if you just search on my ID, John V. Peterson, it's called the ASP Web API example. Now, when I do this here, I'm going to be using Visual Studio 2012 release candidate, but the code that's up there, you can freely open it between Visual Studio 2010 Service Pack 1 to 2012 release candidate. You can go back and forth. And this is implementing the ASP.NET MVC4 release candidate bits. And if you don't have those, if you go to ASP.NET/MVC/MVC4, you can download that stuff. So, okay, enough. That's probably more PowerPoint. If you've ever been in any of my sessions, probably more PowerPoint than you're used to seeing me take on. So let's do this. Let me go ahead and get rid of that. And here I am on my desktop. There was a little bit of a hitch there. So here's what I have. I have two batch files. So this is what and just a tip to throw your way in when I'm writing web applications and I'm doing this kind of work. If I bring up Visual Studio here, so here we are in Visual Studio, and I have a test project, which I'm going to show you. So here's my web API, and then here's my MVC web API client. Now, and really the goal for this session obviously is for you to see what this code can do and to show you where certain things are so that you on your own can go through it and step through it a few times. One of the other, as I've been refactoring this, one of the other projects that are in here is the serializer. So it basically handles all the heavy lifting. It's an abstraction around JSON.NET that takes care of basically making it easier for you to swap out your own serializer if you wanted to do it. But if you've never worked with JSON.NET, which is baked in to the stack now, I don't know if you'll ever look back. So that's a great environment in terms of working with JSON. Okay, so anyway, in the projects, if I open up the API, in the directory, I have a batch file that basically cranks up web API. I'm using IIS Express, so I'm just firing that up. So this will work for you. You download the code. If you have IIS Express, it'll work for you right out. Should work for you right out of the box. So I now have my web API running. Now, if you have Web Matrix, you can also use Web Matrix 2 to see the activity. I kind of like the simple, clean interface that the command prompt here gives me. So I've been doing this now this way for about a year and a half, and old habits die hard. So this is what I have. But if you have Web Matrix, that'll also work to see a lot of the activity. So here it is. Here's the Web API. Now, what does the code look like for the Web API? Well, there's some things in here that kind of look MVC-like. We'll see that we have a thing called a controller. And if I go ahead and click on that, we'll see that I have a number of actions in this controller. Now, if we go to the top, we'll see that it's part of system.web.http.api controller. That's what my products controller is inheriting from. Okay, so it's called a controller, but you'll see that it's actually not in system.web.mvc. Now, if you're used to working in MVC, one of the phrases that you often hear is the notion of convention over configuration. In other words, follow a few simple conventions will mean less code that you have to write, less configuring that you have to do. And nowhere is that more true than with the ASP.NET Web API. Let me just check the questions here real quick. Okay, perfect. All right, I can get to those a little bit later. I just wanted to make sure that everybody could hear me. So, so with this API, notice the names here. We have delete product, get products, post product, put product, and I have another one here called reset products. Now, just so that you're aware, this web API, in a real case, the web API itself obviously would be talking to some database. I've made this very, very portable. I have a class here called products repository. I'm not going to spend too much time in here, but basically I've implemented the repository pattern here. In here, there is a static. There's a static property in here for a list of products, and if you want to consider this to be like a mock of a database or a data store, that's fine, except that it's completely read-write. Obviously, in a real situation, we would not be using this. We'd actually be connected to a database. But I wanted to take the notion of a database out of this, just so that we didn't have to deal with that. So, and this, by the way, this scenario, this Gizmo 1, 2, and 3, I actually started from the examples that were up on the ASP.NET site. And what I wanted to do was provide additional examples on actually updating data, deleting data, and just doing some things in a more real-world type of example so that folks would have an easier time picking this stuff up. So with that, if we go back to the products controller, notice the names again. Now, if you have familiarity with MVC and some of the attributes that are out there, you'll see that in the case of get product, and I'll bring that one up, you'll see that it accepts an integer, an ID, and it goes to the products repository and it passes that ID in. Now, notice though that there's no verb here. And if we look at post, which is right here, post product, which as we would expect, it accepts a product. So imagine I'm passing a product in, I'm posting a product, I'm creating a product. Notice we get full binding here. Now at the end of the day, what I'm ultimately passing to the API is a set of JSON, but Web API makes it very, very simple to take that data for me and to go through the process of handling the model binding for me. So you'll see that in this example, the methods in here, like any good controller, the controller is very thin. There's not much going on there, just enough to expose an endpoint and then to pass responsibility on to something else. But you can see that for the naming means something here. Because this begins with the name post, this then responds to a post. Notice for the update, it's called put product. So that responds to a put. So I don't have to worry about decorating things. Now, I do have a little bit of a convenience method in here called reset products. And the way that I have that repository set up is that if I delete everything, in my reset, I'm basically just deleting everything and essentially putting that collection of products back to the way that it was when I first started. And I have to do that from some outside thing. Well, since it's not named correctly, or it's not named with the configuration of delete, since I already have a delete products, just as an example, I just showed you can override the convention and you can configure it, and you can then you can ultimately name these things whatever you would like. Okay, so there is our web API. Now, how would we interact with it? Well, it's actually not that difficult. It's actually quite simple. Let me bring up a browser here So here we are, and I'm just going to go ahead and hit refresh. Now, if I go over to the instance of the, of my web server of web API running, notice what we have here. We got a request coming in. So that's one of the nice things I like about, firing up the website, through IIS with the batch file, because here's the URL that came in. So it's localhost 18950/API/products. No parameter here. And notice what got returned and what got echoed to the browser. Those are the list of 3 products. Now, if I want to pass in a particular product, whoops, kind of messed that up. 1 second. Let me put that back where it was. One second. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is, let me try and minimize, resize the browser slightly. Let me go ahead and minimize Visual Studio. And then what I'll do is, while I'm issuing the request, then you'll see this update down here. So let me just go ahead and, there we go. Let's see how that looks. I think it's repainting. There we go. See, this is the benefit of having what you're seeing. Okay, so that's now just refreshed. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to pass in the parameters. So I'll just pass in 1. So you saw the web API taking that request, and then of course it passed back this serialized product. If we go back over to Visual Studio and we go into the get product for the ID, notice what it's returning. It's bound to product. So inside the API, it goes through the process of it's doing its own serialization and deserialization. It takes care of it for us, and it does it with the binding. So in a very raw fashion here, I don't have to worry about it. Now, there's some limitations with dealing with a browser, because if all you care about is working with gets, well then, hey, great, that's not a problem. But what about put, post, and delete? Well, that's where Fiddler comes in. So let me bring up Fiddler, and let me issue that same command. Here it is, localhost 18950 API products. Let me click execute. Let me double click this, and you'll see there's the JSON that comes in. I'll show it raw. There it is. Now, if you remember earlier on in this presentation, I talked about how the web API itself natively will deal with either JSON or XML. It really depends on the client and what the client asks for. So isn't that a nice thing that you just have the data exposed, and one customer of your data or one consumer of your data says, well, I needed XML, and the other one says, well, I needed JSON, and you get the luxury of just saying to them, well, then ask for it. Ask for the data. And how would you do that? Well, again, we're in the web world. We're in the HTTP world. What do? It's real simple. We specify the content type. And by specifying the content type, now we can't really do this in the browser. We can do it in, we can do it with developer tools in, Firefox and things like that. But again, being away from the browser here, I'm going to go ahead and add a request header. So I'm going to type in content type. And this time, these are just key value pairs, I'm going to type text/XML. I'm going to invoke the same command again. Notice the difference. Let's go to raw here. Array of product. And in this array of product, you can see that we have this very long XML string. So just by setting the content type, we have the ability to set how the web API is going to respond with a certain data type. Now, going back to the browser, I have a couple browsers here. Here's Chrome, and I'm going to go ahead and hit refresh. You can see that IE was getting JSON back. And in this case, this is requesting XML by default. And if I brought up, here is, if I bring up, let me just go ahead and copy that. And if I go over to Firefox, I think it's going to give me the same thing. It's going to go ahead and give me, an XML string back. So there you go. It's really just dependent on the client. Now, at this point, we're dealing with this web API in a very, very raw fashion. Over on the Visual Studio side, you may remember another project that was sitting in there called, here's another one called Web API Test. So to make it easier for you to see how all this stuff works, what I did is I've created a test fixture that basically exercises the web API, delete product, get products, post product. And what I've done is, again, using get product as an example, I basically have a test set up in here that makes sure that the back end is in a known good state. So if we follow our three A's of testing, act, arrange, assert, this is a great way to learn how the API works. So and this is where some of these helper classes that I've created that I hope that you'll find useful. So here's expected. So the expected would be this, right? So we have this JSON string. And then my actual, I have HTTP helpers.get HTTP content. And then what I've done here is I basically have I have a URL. Now let's just see what this URL happens to be. It looks like I've got something called REST service and an API path. Let's go to the app config here in the test project. Remember, think database connection string. Think that. So here what I've done is I've created some app settings. So one key is called REST service, which is my local host 18950. My API path is API/products, but I may have maybe a better name for this would be product API path or something like that, because in reality you probably would have multiple, you'd have multiple paths sharing one root REST service. I have a similar kind of thing over on the MVC side, which you'll see in a moment. So just to review real quick, you've seen through the browser, you've seen a couple of things through Fiddler. What if we ran all of this through? What if we ran everything through here that did put, posts, deletes, did everything? So let me go ahead and run these tests. So I'll right click up in here, just test, run test. We'll just let this cook for a second. It's going to take just a couple of seconds here. Okay, there you go. So they all passed. Let's take a look at our what got echoed out. Well, sure enough, it responded to everything. So through that code, which you're used to working with, and you can easily interact now with this web API service through a test. This handles all that for you. So for example, let's take a look at put product. So how would we put a product? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show this through the test, and then I'm going to flip back over to Fiddler so you can see it there. And then toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to put it all together by then consuming this thing in an actual application, in an MVC application. So here's the old content. So again, put means to update. So that means it has to be an existing product. So here's the existing product. So the existing product would be ID is 1, the name is Gizmo1, and the price is $1.99. My new content, we'd keep the same ID, but look what we're doing here. The name is now going to be called the new title, and the price is $99.99. So what I'm effectively doing here is that I'm effectively updating the name and the price. Now, this is really no different than if I went to a web page and I brought up that product in a page. So we have our, just to review again, we have our old content and we have our new content. We're updating the name and we're updating the price. And that's real, again, no different than if we went to a web page and we did this, but here we're doing it in a very raw fashion. Now what we're doing here is, you can see we're actually sending, here's the new content, our REST service, and what we're ultimately doing here, and actually I'm verifying the existence of the state of product 1. Here's the update. So if we're going to update data, I am effectively passing that content to the API. Now that may be kind of hard to see here, so let's do it over in Fiddler, and this is exactly what the test is doing. So here we are, we're back in Fiddler. Let me just run this up. Okay, I'm going to go to Composer. I'm going to go ahead and grab product 1 here. And I'll go ahead and grab that raw, I'm going to go ahead and grab that raw string, which is actually in XML, which I don't want. So let me just set that, either I'll just remove the content, or I can actually be explicit here and I'll just say text JSON. Go ahead and execute that again. Here we go. Here's the raw. I'm going to copy that. And you can see that it already got updated. So I'm going to set the content back to the way that it was. And again, if I get all the products here, execute, you will see that, and sure enough, the first one, the new title, price $99.99. I'm going to set the title back to Gizmo 1 and the price is $1.99. I'm going to effectively do what the test is doing on its own. So I'm going to go to the Composer. Here's my URL. This is where we can manipulate the verb. This is going to be a put. Down here is the request body. So we go ahead and we put in our data. And I'm going to set it to $1.99. And I'm going to set this to Gizmo 1. And I'm going to click execute. Notice a 200 came back. Now, actually, I'm not returning anything. I probably should be returning the new state of the product, but I'll do that. I'll do that sometime down the road. But what I can do is go to Composer, take the request body out, reset the method to get, put in ID 1, click execute, and check it out. The name is back to Gizmo 1 and the price is $1.99. So what was really going on behind the scenes there? Well, if we go to our controller, and this is the test, we go to products controller. That's a put. So if I go to the put product method, basically it's passing responsibility to product repository.update product. So if I go to that definition, what's it doing? Well, remember, I'm passing JSON to the web API. It's binding to product. And just so that you can see it, here's the product. So basically it has 3 properties: ID, name, and price. And that's it. So if we go back to the product repository and the update, now keep in mind, separation of concerns here, right? Does the product repository know anything about the web API? It doesn't. It's just something that the web API consumes. That's why the names here are a bit more normal, like get, update, add, delete. Because this product repository could be used by anything. It just so happens that the web API service is invoking this service. So we're passing a product in, and you can see, essentially, it's just doing its thing, just like any other repository would, interacting with its data source. So that's, in a nutshell, how things are working with the API. And of course, if we go back to Fiddler, I can delete a product very simply. If I want to delete product number 1, all I got to do is go to Composer, change my verb to delete, hit execute, and I get a 200 back. What if I try to delete that again? Or better yet, what if I invoke a get on that product ID number 1? Check it out, 404. I have the web API configured to throw a 404 when it can't find a product that you passed in. Now, I have no idea what type of process is actually interacting with my web API. But because it's RESTful, because we're adhering to HTTP standards, it's documented for me already. It's like, well, if I throw a 404, it means you requested a resource that doesn't exist. Let's take a look back over at our products controller and let's see what it's doing. Let's go to the get product. So check this out. It says, well, okay, let's put this in a try. So it says, well, return product repository get ID. Now it turns out that I have the product repository. I have a not found exception. I create an exception. And you can see what we're doing here is I'm catching it, and then I'm throwing a new exception, and it's a special type of exception. It's an HTTP response exception. And it has a part of, in the constructor, it's accepting a new HTTP response message, and the status code here is not found. So that's how you can easily equip your APIs with the right responses. So what we've done here is we've translated a data situation of, well, you didn't find it, and we've converted it, we've translated it into a web-friendly type of response. Now keep in mind, the repository that we're working with, it just threw an exception. It has no idea what's consuming it, and that's why it's important for the controller to say, okay, I need to take this generic not found and convert it to basically a web response that's a 404. And at that point, you're off to the races. So now, of course, if this is all we could do with the web API, that wouldn't be very, very convenient. So the big question then gets to is, well, how do we effectively interact with this web API with an application like MVC? Well, let's take a look again over at our project here, but let me just check the Q&A here. All right, let me go ahead and just let me go ahead and answer some of these, because these are good ones here. So if I want to add a product to the bucket, which is better approach to pass product ID, basket ID via URL or via post data? Well, I would say that if you have any sort of side effect, and if you're adding a product, you should post it. If you're updating a product, you should put it. But you want to be careful about putting things all in your URLs, because, I mean, that's if you're in a get situation, the only way you're getting data back to the server then is through a query string, since you can't have a request body in your in a get. Now, I suppose you could put some things in a request header and things like that, but that might be a bit non-conventional. So I hope I answered that, but I mean, you would definitely want to stick with, if you're adding something, it's a post. If you're updating something, it's a put. Next question: is this data flow of API for MVC? What would be the performance compared to traditional data flow used on web forms? I'm thinking on the part where all must be serialized and deserialized. Well, so this is kind of a situation where, depending on what your context is in view models. Now, when you serialize things down, in JSON, it gets to be very, very efficient. So it's really a matter of just, how complex your objects are. And if in a given environment you only need certain portions of an object or of some entity, well, that's a case where, view models, may certainly kick in and, may be very, very helpful. But certainly, you do need to be very, very mindful of the amount of data you're serializing back and forth. It's really no different than the number of JavaScript libraries that you're consuming and things like that. You need to, those are just things that you always need to be very, very, very mindful of. How do we deal with images in the response and request? Well, they can be, they can be serialized to, they can be, they're binary. I don't have an example of that, but another way is that you certainly can have those sitting as a URL. You can just pass the URL in and just grab those. There's any number of ways that you can deal with that as well. They certainly can be binary. You can have those embedded in JSON, or you can have those embedded in XML if you want. Next question: how does it work to perform gets by parameters different of ID like search, assuming that you have a relation of products and vendors and product managers? Wow, the questions are really starting to pop in here, so I'm only going to handle a couple more before I get the rest of these. Think of JSON as like a document, so that you can manage a lot of those relationships. And I certainly would encourage you to look to see how non-SQL databases work, Mongo, Raven, what have you, with respect to, with JSON. But also remember, how do you deal with these situations today transactionally, right? So you have a repository that is exposed via a web API. That repository today is connected to a database. Is it calling store procedures? Is it passing? How is it managing a transaction context? At that level of it, there's really no difference here. What you're doing from the web API on up to the client obviously is a bit different, but from the web API and it's interacting with data back really should not be any different. That's very, very important to understand. And your data story really shouldn't be influenced by the by the client that you have sitting on top of it, whether that's a Windows form, a WPF form, or a web API. I'm going to answer one more before I continue on. How would you version this sort of interface? What about in a year when product has some new properties, and what about deprecating different action art controller? That's a great question. So I used to do a lot of consulting at a place called Yellowbook at yellowbook.com, and we had a completely service-oriented interface, and basically we would version that API. So in the URL, you'd have embedded in the URL, v1, v2, or v1.1, depending on how you did it. And you'd have to create either, controllers, or you'd have to create, you create new controllers, or, routing to go so that the serialization matched the version of the objects that you're working with. And basically what you definitely want to have is a set of tests that give different versions of your API coverage, because when you then create a new version of your API, one of the things you want to make sure is that does not present a breaking change with old versions. So obviously at some point in your build process, you're running a full regression. Then it's just a matter of how long you're supporting old versions of your how long you're supporting old versions of your API at that point. So, but that's actually something that I've been meaning to write about, because that's extremely important. So I will get to the rest of the questions at the conclusion of this session. So let's take a look over at MVC and let's see what we have here. Now I also have, let me go ahead and just minimize a few things here. So here's the web API. I need to keep that up and running, but here is, then I have another web application, which is the MVC client. I'm going to go ahead and double click that and just bring that guy to life. And let me go ahead and bring up that API client and what that looks like in the browser. Oh, I'm sorry, excuse me, the MVC application. So just give this a second. Okay. Now, just to prove to you that this is actually really working, let me go ahead and minimize that up just a little bit. So here's the MVC client, which you can see a whole bunch of stuff happen there. And then here's the Web API client. So imagine, whoops, so imagine this. So here's the request going to the Web API client. The Web API client then has to interact with the Web API. The Web API then will, remember that data flow, will then go back up through the Web API client, and then we will then get something back on the in the browser. So for instance, let's create a new product. Now notice the Web API didn't get hit. There's no need to there, right? Because all we're doing is we're just spinning up a, an empty product. So I'm going to call this Gizmo 5. And the price of this product is going to be $5.55. Now I'm going to hit create. Now what create's going to do is it's going to go to a method. And if I go to the Web API client and I go to this controller, let's take a look here. Now these have the names that you would normally see in a typical MVC type of application. So here I have, here's the create, which is the get version, because all it's doing is essentially just spinning up a new empty product. And then we have the create, which is the post version, which accepts the product, which accepts it from our request when we post this here, because this is a form. And essentially what all this is, what we're doing here is the product repository here, then on the MVC side, what it's actually doing is it's communicating with the Web API. Remember, what's a repository? The repository is an abstraction around some data store. From the vantage point of the Web API, the data store would probably be the database. What's the data store from the vantage point of MVC or from some other client? It's going to be the Web API service. So if we come up here, and if I right click and go to definition on this products repository, this product repository is working with the REST service, and this is where all the serialization is occurring, because you see that it's a boundary that's getting crossed. We have the MVC side. It's got to communicate with some service. That's a boundary. So while within their own domain, within MVC, within the API that itself, it handles its own serialization and deserialization, the communication from MVC to the Web API and from the Web API back to MVC, that serialization has to be managed by us. And that's where basically these helper methods in the product repository help out. So if I minimize this, I'm going to hit create. So let's go ahead and do that. Okay. So what happened over here? Well, if we look for the word post, here it is. There's the post. Here we're creating. Down here, though, what happened? Well, let's find it. Here's our post. So this got the post, and then that ended with a 200, and then we ended up doing a get, because you see, where am I back to? I'm back to my index page. Let me just maximize this. Whoops, let me not totally maximize that. Let me just bring that right here. There's our Gizmo 5. By the way, notice our Gizmo 1 is gone because we deleted it. So all this is talking to the same thing. That's the same database. So we can edit. I can say, well, no, it's Gizmo FIVE, and I can hit save. and there it is. Now, if I go back, let's just say I go to Fiddler. Say, well, let me go to Fiddler and let me just grab all my products over here. Double click that, and there it is. Gizmo 5. It's right there. So we're all talking to the same data. Variety of clients hitting this. What other kinds of clients can we hit with? Well, turns out we've got this guy over here. Let me just hit refresh on this. Notice the URL here, localhost 33547, products.html. This is just basically a static kind of HTML page. It's got some JavaScript in here. That is just an HTML page sitting in my web app. That's my MVC application. I'm going to hit refresh here. Okay, it just changed. What's behind the scenes here? Well, if I hit reload, let's take a look at what the kind of code that we're stepping through here. Here is, let's see if I can make that work correctly. So here's my data. Let's find our data here. Here's data. Oh, actually, it's key values. So here we are. So now we're on Gizmo 2. Keep spinning through this thing. I'll just keep resuming. There's Gizmo 3, resume. There's Gizmo 5. You see, get JSON, HTTP localhost 18950. Here's our API. Here's our products. Here's something else very, very important for you to remember. And this has to do with cross-site scripting. Out of the box, Web API isn't going to help you with this, but it turns out that it's very, very simple to deal with. It's question mark callback equals question mark. So I have this basically, I'm telling the server, hey, wrap your request in basically be question mark with paren and then the JSON packet inside that. Basically, it's to essentially get around a browser limitation with cross-site scripting. What's the problem here? Well, where's our Web API? Well, here's our Web API on 18950. This page exists in the domain off of port 33547. They're not part of the, they're two different sites. So how do we get around that little problem? Well, turns out it's not that difficult. If we go back over to the Web API and we go to the global ASAX and we go down to under application start, I have a global configuration. I have a JSON P formatter in here. And basically it is taking care of looking out for it's taking the work of looking for requests with the callback and doing the things that are necessary to wrap that request so that a browser, because that's what we're dealing with here. See, if you're doing all this stuff with Fiddler or you're doing stuff on a back end, service to service, and it's away from the browser, this doesn't become a problem for you. But in the context of a browser, it is a problem. So let me just to show you, let me go ahead and just run through all that. And let me just close that up. Let me just open up another tab here. I'll just put that in. Actually, that's not going to work because that's rendering it back as XML. Let me go over here and put it in here. See, question mark, paren. So it basically just wraps it, and that's how that works. So make sure you take a look at that, because for this to have really any benefit at all, it's got to be able to deal with requests from another site. Otherwise, ain't going to do much good. Let's see here. So what you've seen now is our MVC application dealing with our Web API. By the way, how does the MVC application know where to go? Well, let's go over there. Here's the MVC Web API client. And if I go to web config, app settings, REST service API path. So just like I had them for the tests were just another client. The MVC application in this case is just another client. In an MVC application, if you're connected to a database, you got to have a database connection string somewhere. You typically would have that in the web.config. There is no database here. Our database, the data that we're working with, is exposed in our web API client. And how do we find it? Well, this is just the mechanism that I used. There's all kinds of different ways that you could go about doing that if you wanted. Once the application, the MVC application, knows how to work with it, which, by the way, which portion of my application has that responsibility? In this case, it's going to be, let me just bring that up. So we have products repository. Now what I did is I put this in another, just so you're aware, it's another project. It's called data. So I've been, again, slowly but surely refactoring these things out. So this guy could be consumed by anything. So this guy is basically the abstraction over the web API. So the MVC client basically interacts with this guy, who ultimately interacts with the web API. Eventually, the tester will interact with this as well. And I think you can start to see how the different pieces all start to flow together, because our MVC application already has to serialize and deserialize data, has to do all that anyway. So working with a REST service turns out to not be that big of a deal. And when your data is exposed as a REST service, it becomes very, very simple to start making use of other technologies, such as if we go back over here, if we go over here, and this is just straight up jQuery and JavaScript that's interacting with that RESTful service. So when you get this code, first off, if you don't have Fiddler, you definitely want to get Fiddler. You go through the PowerPoint for the data flows. And then the first place that I would suggest that you look as you start to work through this code is to go to the web API tests. Run those a few times. Get used to them. Understand, how is the test actually, what exactly is being put under test and how the different pieces work together, and you step through it. Definitely something I suggest that you do. So let's go to your questions here and let's see what we got. So let's see. Don't know if I answered this one. How do you configure IIS Express with client access policy XML to allow testing an API from another domain? Well, that's actually, I think that's the cross-site well, I'm not sure if I understand. How do you configure IIS client access policy XML to allow testing an API from another domain? I'm not sure that I understand the question, but if you would, email me offline or follow me on Twitter, and we'll exchange emails and we'll look at that, because I'm not sure that I quite understand what that question relates to. I think I answered this one. How do you represent a one-to-many association with a web API? For example, product and orders. Well, again, if you look at a nested document, JSON, so a document can contain documents. So and probably one of the easier ways to view that is to actually look at this example here. So here I am, I'm getting that data. You see how I'm iterating through the data. The data in this case is just one level, value, so value.name. But what if there was like suppliers? What if my product had many suppliers for that one product? Well, then I would just have a nested iteration through value.suppliers. And if that's the way that complex object is being serialized, we won't have a problem dealing with it. And JSON is extremely up to the task at handling those sorts of things. Let's go back to our Q&A here. Would you send and receive view models or entities? Well, in reality, in the MVC world, what we are really always dealing with are actually view models. I mean, they are views, but in reality, they're view models. But I don't tend to be really strict with it. I mean, if you find that because you're carving up your data in different ways, maybe depending on permissions and things like that, a view model, where you have a strict view, which is one for the entity, and then you have a view model, which is specific to that view that you're working with. If that works well for you, great. I can see cases on both sides, and I would just say, whatever works best for you, do that. I've seen folks where they have a view and a view model, and the view model is exactly the same as the view, and I just sort of put my hands up and say, well, is it really necessary? I sort of follow that mantra of, Yagni, you ain't gonna need it yet. That's type of thing. Until you need it, don't worry about it. But that's just me. Any indication on when full release version of Web API will be available? So it does have a go live license. And what that means is that you can use this in production work today. By the way, one other important point, this is all open source. Web API along with Razor Engine, MVC4, I think Signal R2 is all open source. So they're actually accepting pull requests. So if it's me, I'm already using the Web API in a couple production applications today. It's working very well. I can't imagine that there are going to be huge changes between now and when it's released, but I don't know. What we do know is that this stack, MVC4 and all that, are in band. So historically, MVC has always been an out of band type of deal. It's never released concurrently with Visual Studio, but of course, TFS, Visual Studio 12, and Windows 8, it's all going at the same time. So maybe around the fall, I'm guessing. I haven't paid too much attention on exactly when, if there's even been a release date. I don't think there has been. But it'll basically release when the rest of MVC and when Visual Studio releases. Let's say I have a lead object. It has a collection of email addresses. I don't want to post just the lead and then post email objects. What is the best practice to handle a situation where I need to post dependent objects to a parent object? The same type of practice that you would handle with an ORM. So we see this is not a new problem. This is something that we would do with an ORM today, whether it's you're using Entity Framework or whether you're using NHibernate. So if you're using if your repositories are constructed correctly, there's nothing that really should stop you from taking the repository that you have today, putting a Web API in front of it. And that's actually a pretty good test for you to work with to see is like, can you start interacting with Fiddler and that you are interacting with your objects as JSON and you're manipulating them, and then basically you're using the Web API to effectively be almost a test harness around your repository. And that repository should basically be the gatekeeper to your ORM world, whether it's NHibernate, Entity Framework, or whatever. And those things should be handling that. Now, how you present that on the front end, well, then now you're just dealing with JSON. And that's not a new problem. So you have to remember something here is that we're still passing the same objects back and forth. The only difference is that instead of working with a database before directly, you're just using a Web API that's standing between you and the database. What about I was waiting for this one. What about authentication and authorization? What's the best way to handle it within the Web API? Well, I don't know if there's one single best way. One way is, and something that I've been experimenting with is some encrypted tokens. Like one way is HTTPS, so communicating, and IIS Express does that very well. Where you're dealing with HTTPS at that point, and maybe having an authorization token in your header, and then you can even start to log to see, well, who are you versus your authorization and token, match that up with the IP address you're coming from. There's also OAuth, another approach to work with. So a lot of different approaches to it. I don't know there's any specific one that I would recommend. It's like a lot of different things. It just depends on what works best for your situation. But those are a couple of ideas. I've written about some of that on my blog. So hopefully that'll help. Let's see here. How would you do searches like product? Oh, okay. So the I didn't show this, but when you get this, if you go to the Web API controller, and you go to get product, I have to find, I have an here it is, queryable. So get products. So if you pass an OData type of URL, this will actually, it'll just work with it, and it will return you the subset. The key is that you got to use the attribute queryable, and then of course this has to be iQueryable. So if you just pass in and I think in the README somewhere I have an example of that. So that's how that would work. So I am definitely out of time. I am like at 30 seconds over. I think I've addressed. Okay, we got one more here. Let's see here. How do you pass more than one object's product employee to the API or post method? Well, there's nothing that says that you can't just pass one big old. You got a view model. This is definitely a view model type of thing where it contains in a product or employee or some mashed up object or whatever. It gets serialized. And how does the data format? How's the data format in the request body? Well, again, it just gets serialized as JSON. So, and that actually happens today. When you're working with MVC, when I'm working with the data on the client, I'm passing things down. When it gets to the controller, it's model binding that goes on. So these are all things that happen today. And I think I'll just leave with that thought that the Web API is a way to make your data, is to expose your data. But all the ways that it works and how we're interacting with things, it's all things that we're doing today. So I would definitely have you all take a deep breath and just realize, like, okay, you know what? Transactions, databases, you know what? I'm doing that today. I would say this: if you find yourself changing the way you're doing that because you're trying to work with the Web API, you're doing it wrong. You should not alter the way that you're interacting with your ultimate backend data store because of your client. There should be clear separation there. And as long as you remember that, you should be fine. Please read my blog. Pay attention to all the stuff on ASP.net. I'm way over time, so thank you very much for attending. Please rate this session. I hope you found this informative. Thank you very much.